Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our next panel. And just now we're going to be talking about English as a foreign language and how secondary schools in the UAE support this. I think this is an increasingly interesting area given the kind of recent influx of families we've had from all over the world. So I think this has really brought this topic to the kind of top of the pile, as it were. My name is Fiona Mackenzie. I'm from Carfax Education. I'm head of education there. And I'm delighted to be joined by a panel today, including Gemma Donovan, who is the whole school EAL, English as an additional language. We'll get on to the kind of acronyms later. Who is the lead for this? Oh, sorry, Gemma. I beg your pardon, Gemma Donovan, who is the lead for EAL at Southview School. We have Giles Pruitt, who is the executive principal at the Arcadia Schools. We have Dr. Neil Hopkins, who is the director of education for Fortis Education. And we have Chelsea Wilson, who is the director of curriculum and academic standards at GEMS Al Khalij International School. So I think what's rather fabulous today is we've got two kind of executive principals and we've got two practitioners who are on the ground. So I think we should be able to get a really interesting mixture of kind of top level and what it's really like to kind of deliver this. So I think my first question to you all is, why? Why do students want to study in English? What's the kind of key driver here? I mean, I know we have a lot of English schools here, but why is that so attractive? Chelsea, can we start with you?
Sure. I mean, I think a key reason why students want to study English is because they're interested in broadening their options for university education. And I think if they have the experience of studying in an English medium environment in a secondary setting, then it gives them a lot more opportunity and flexibility as they move into their college applications.
Is there anything you would add to that?
Well, I think that the context for language learning in itself is fascinating. We're here in Dubai. We understand that many schools are wrestling with Arabic tuition, and yet to be able to speak in Arabic is terrifically important. Of course, we understand the importance of Mandarin and Mandarin Chinese and how important that is. Spanish, arguably, is a language that will be very important to learn. So I think there are other alternative languages that many students and perhaps their parents would like them to learn. So why English? Well, in part, I think that English medium schools have a very good reputation for the quality of their academic standards. And I would agree entirely that a big driver within that is the ultimate destination. So I think many parents, when they're selecting that pathway that they want through their child's education from, let's say, 11 to 18, are actually saying, what's happening after 18? Where do I want my child to be? Where do I see my child working? What kind of language might be helpful? Now, whether or not English actually is something that is going to continue as a lingua franca around the world, many people are already saying it's not that actually there are other languages now that are becoming more important for students to learn. So I don't know whether it's a status that will continue forever, but certainly I think twinned with the quality of academic tuition that students get in English language schools, that probably still leaves it at the top of the pile.
That's interesting, yes. And as you say, that maybe this is a status quo that may change over time. Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. I mean, Giles, for you, as a kind of whole school, how do you approach this? You know, you're an English medium school, but we're increasingly welcoming children from all over the world for whom English is not their native language, for whatever reason they want to study in English medium school. How do you incorporate that into a kind of whole school philosophy?
Well, on the ground, I mean, just building on what Neil said there, is that when we speak to families about why they want to come into an English-speaking school to start with, is they see the destination post-18 as one of the most important factors, particularly coming to the United Arab Emirates, when we have such a multicultural society, but is a stepping stone to post-18 education, and looking at the gold standard through English National Curriculum, the IB, US Common Core programs, they're still all delivered in English medium in universities. So I think that's a big driver. From a school perspective, therefore, it's very important, and particularly here in the Middle East, we have 80 nationalities in our school, so we have a responsibility to the students to ensure that they can access our curriculum program to the best of their ability. So an English language learning program is essential for that. Early identification at admissions, making sure that we actually can provide for the specific needs for the children to be able to access our curriculum through that medium is very, very important. Under the umbrella in the United Arab Emirates as well, looking at marginalised groups and societies as well, that's very important for our educational platform, and where we're providing the best care for children to get the best out of their long-term assessments. We still are measured, whether that's right or wrong. We still are measured in post-16 and post-18 outcomes, and we have that responsibility for families to make sure the children are prepared for those if they decide to stay in that particular curriculum.
Yes, so it is very much about, as you say, giving them the best opportunities to access the curriculum. I mean, that must also have implications, Gemma, because at the age at which the children join the school, because language acquisition takes some time.
Well, that's right. At language acquisition, they say to become fully fluent and competent in a language, it can take between 6 to 7 years. Well, obviously, we don't have that time frame. So within the first 2 years, students are usually very capable with their social English, but they lack the academic language, and that's where myself and our team at Southview then step in and work closely with the classroom teachers, and our approach is very much content language integrated learning, so team planning, looking at pre-teaching vocabulary, things like that. So just really providing these students with the tools to be able to access the curriculum. As you said, they don't have that time and that luxury to learn the language fully, so it's just giving them those key tools to maximise their potential.
Their kind of chances in the time frame that they have.
In the time frame that they have.
Yeah. So within the Fortis group, I mean, Dr. Neil, is there like a cut-off point at which you say, if you come to us at this point with no English, it's going to be really tough to deliver on those outcomes?
No, there isn't. I'm sure I speak for everybody here, that we always want to make sure that we put the child first. Many children, especially if they don't have English as a first language, and in recent times we've seen students arriving who not only have English as a second or maybe a third language, but actually also perhaps have left some trauma or have left home unexpectedly. They're coming with a whole bunch of other issues that actually perhaps are more important to them than actually the language of instruction in school. We take it very seriously at Fortis Education that we're going to put children right at the centre of our care and concern, that our commitment is to ensure that we forget the challenges that regulatory pressure might put on us, and we say, here's a person, and this person needs support and needs help. And what can we do to support them in that regard? So with regard to that, of course, it is then about the practicality of how you get that support to the child in the class, and there are many different ways of doing them. At Fortis Education, at St Mark's School, we have in place an intensive English language program that we put the students in, and there are many different ways that the students can be part of that. Sometimes it's about being in class and having work differentiated differently for that particular child. Sometimes it's about being out of class and having a level of support, and there might be different gradations of support that we might give them, more time out of class in a small group intensive support, but then returning into the classroom. And then at the other end of that spectrum, we have students who are taught entirely in a class of their own, focusing on a particular form of English. And for us, that particular form of English is academic English. Because, of course, many children, if we did nothing, children would learn English language if they spent time around other English language speaking children. Not necessarily the English we want them to learn, but they would very definitely be able to converse in the vernacular of whatever the playground language is. But actually, we can see that there are many students that arrive at our school gates who perhaps have very high levels of development in, let's say, mathematics. But actually, they don't have the academic language of mathematics to be able to unpick that. And no amount of time in the playground is going to give that. Not many children spend their break times talking about calculus. I don't know why, I mean, it's odd, I know, but they don't seem to spend their time doing that. So the children are never going to get that. There are certain words, there's a certain vocabulary set that simply doesn't occur in normal everyday English. And the children reading books and watching Harry Potter, whatever it might be that they might have as incidental ways of picking up English at home, they're never going to access that vocabulary. And so they will always underperform in their academic studies for that subject because they don't have that specific vocabulary. So we have a particular program for children that have zero English when they come, which is not only about acquiring English, but also getting the basics of school English, of academic English.
I think it's very interesting what you say. We work with a lot of students at Carfax as well for whom English isn't their native language. And when you put them through the Cat 4 tests and things, and you have a sentence like a babbling brook, and these kids are like, what's a babbling brook? I mean, I think we forget the level of colloquialism that there is, as well as the technical language, just the sheer level of colloquialism that we take for granted. And Giles, how many nationalities have you got at Arcadia?
So we have 80 in our school in JVT. So of that group, we have 60% of our children are native English, 30% are English who have English as a second language, but very proficient and don't need any additional intervention. And then just over 10% of our children are in our English language learner program. So again, as to follow on from Neil, some parts of that are intensive, some parts of that are supported within the class context. But I think I pick up on the best phrase. If you want to see a really good quality English language learner program, there's got to be some collaborative planning between the language learning team and the teaching team. It shouldn't be done in isolation. And part of the profile is about integrating the children slowly over time. As we said, it could take between 1 and 7 years to be fully integrated into the academic curriculum. So that early identification for the children, we use a program called WEDA, I'm sure you're very familiar with it, which allows us to see how well integrated to the language program the children are at each entry point, with the idea to pull away from that program as soon as we feel the children are able to cope with the academic pathway and the curriculum content at that time. But that can't be done in isolation. We can't say English language learning sits over there and you class teach over there. That's very important. So collaborative planning, team planning, through all of the year groups through the school are vitally important to make sure that those children get the best care. And that even can be individual language learning plans. We have IEPs for our children, students of determination. We have individual behaviour plans for children who may struggle with those attributes, and exactly the same thing needs to happen for language learners for them to be successful in the classroom. So it's part of a real team and collaborative approach.
So it's really identifying that child's needs and then really creating a kind of bespoke program. So Chelsea, how does that look on the ground in your school when you're dealing with this?
Sure. So I think the identification piece is key, and a lot of students we identify as soon as they enter our gates for admission, right? So during the admission process, parents can sometimes self-identify students who need additional support. That's great for our team to know right from the beginning. During the admission interview process, we typically have students sit for a MAP exam during admissions, but if we have students coming in who have maybe more limited English, that's not an appropriate admissions assessment. So we'll immediately funnel some of those students towards an assessment like Cat 4 that will give us a little bit more information because it's not so linguistically based. We'll use our team of EAL specialists to help us identify the levels of need that a particular student has, and then we'll schedule them accordingly. Within the school there are different types of programs, so some students are served in the mainstream classroom through differentiation based on their kind of individual starting points. Other students through maybe an intensive reading program, through a pull-out session. So different students based on different needs at different points in their educational journeys.
And I love what you've all been saying about the kind of collaboration. This can't happen just, in the ELL department. It's got to be a whole school approach. But Gemma, how do you do that? I mean, these teachers are in the classroom, they're differentiating their academic teaching between, maybe across a class of 25, 30. They've now got multiple languages. They've also got maybe some additional needs. It's quite a lot to expect. How do you, equip your teachers to deal with that?
It is, but I'm very much an advocate, as we are at Southview, that any provision that's put in place, scaffolded learning, all of the techniques that one would expect to make your classroom more inclusive are helpful for all, crucial for some. So that really is our whole school approach. Also trying to not only focus on the academic standards of the students with regards to their English, but also taking into consideration their social emotional well-being. I think research would dictate that once a child or a person's affective filter is lowered, the language acquisition or general attainment is heightened. So really a big push for that within the school as well to, Maslow before Bloom, as they say. And just make sure the children are feeling settled, our students are settled in, and then the learning that we've put into place comes afterwards. With regards to having full buy-in from the staff who are very busy, as I say, if it's seen as something that benefits all, it seems to be working out.
The buy-in is,
Yeah.
the buy-in
I
is
mean,
easy.
that's a good point, because just as there are different children, there are different teachers, aren't there? And if you're a kindergarten or early years teacher, then your stock in trade is language acquisition. You know, your radar is on full alert for all sorts of different analyses that you're making around that child. And of course, you're used to seeing that developmental progress. And very young children that are 3 or 4 years of age, even that, if you have a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, there's a huge amount of difference between those two children, because of course it's a 25% difference in their cognitive development. So teachers that are used to dealing with children at that age tend to be very finely attuned to that. And as you go throughout the primary or elementary years within schools, we still see a lot of that very early understanding of language acquisition, language development. In secondary schools, it can be very different. So in that high school model, teachers tend to regard themselves, not as generalists, of course, but as subject specialists. And so you could be a physics teacher, but coincidentally, you're also an English language teacher. And that's what's so critical about what you said and what Giles was saying earlier. You can't do this in isolation. You can't say, look, I think you'll find I'm physics. You know, don't talk to me about that. Because, of course, the students in front of you need all of that support. And so the challenge for schools is to make sure that actually every teacher understands themselves at least 50-50 an English language teacher.
I think that's very interesting. And we were talking earlier with the inclusion panel about how valuable it would be as part of your teacher training program to have modules included in that. And I'm guessing actually in this increasingly globalized world we live in, that should also be part of a kind of basic teacher training program, is so that everybody has an understanding of what it's like to do. I had the privilege of sitting in on a biology lesson the other day about diffusion. I was visiting a school in England which has a lot of international students, and I was completely fascinated by the way they scaffolded how they would have scaffolded the children with the vocab on the wall, on the board, and then we all had to do a kind of matching the vocab to the definition. Very different from the way that you're taught when you're a native English speaker. And I was so impressed with that they blended seamlessly into a lesson of kind of mixed nationalities. I was like, oh, okay, I can kind of see now how this works. But it was really, really interesting. But you mentioned the fact that English sort of is in the primacy at the moment, but that may well change. And actually, Chelsea, we were talking earlier about honouring people's original language, and I think that's a really interesting kind of concept. Could you just elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at AKAS, part of our mission is that while we provide an English language learning environment, we honor Emirati language and culture, and that we really want students to stay connected to their roots and where they're from. And I think that's an important piece of language learning. I think historically there's been a little bit of misnomer that kind of an English-only environment is the best environment for learning a second language, and that putting students in a setting where they're really switching cultures and switching languages will be best for them. And we now know that that's just not the case. And so setting up environments where, we were talking just earlier about the hierarchy of needs, making sure that students feel at home in their learning environment and that they know that we value and honor their first language, where they're coming from, and that that's part of our school communities is really crucial, I think, to supporting language acquisition.
I loved your point about Maslow before Bloom's. I thought that was fantastic. I think, again, another part of an effective program is socialization, well-being at the heart of everything for the child, ahead perhaps of instruction and ideas behind those components. So there's a couple of great programs I've seen throughout schools. One that we're offering ourselves, so a mother tongue program, also really helps the socialization attributes of it, but also actually bringing parents in to be part of the parent engagement. So we had 40 English language learner parents qualify through a school WEDA assisted program in the last academic year, and that was actually fantastic because also we don't realise that parents also have English as an additional language, and they really struggle with the colloquialisms of the English language and other aspects such as that. So actually immersing the parents into the engagement of the language learning through the team is fantastic and groundbreaking, and I think that's something that really helps support the children as they grow through and get used to the significant changes. Many who've coming to an English language medium school for the first time ever in their lifetime, and it must be incredibly daunting. I can't imagine putting myself in that footprint at the age of 12, 16, 5, incredibly daunting for somebody for the first time.
That's a critical point, Giles, I think. UNESCO produced a document 3 years ago, called Rethinking Learning. And what they identified amongst the whole drive around language acquisition was that there are 3 themes that are crucially important for children really thriving in an educational environment. One of which is empathy, so learning to empathize. If you think about being an ELL learner coming in, you feel very isolated. Perhaps there's nobody else in the school that speaks your language, and the language that is being spoken is one that currently at that point in time is very difficult for you to grasp, or you have a very emergent grasp of the language, and therefore you sound infantile even though you're not. So empathy is very important within an environment that everybody within the school organization is empathetic to others. But equally, perspective taking. So once you've empathized, you're able to take somebody else's perspective. That was something that UNESCO brought out as being very powerful and important for them. And of course, the final one was compassion, that once you've been able to take someone else's perspective, you're then motivated to go and act to do something to help them. So what we found at Force Education was that ELL was actually, it needed the augmentive support of our program of positive education, positive psychology, an approach to supporting other people, to encouraging an environment of thriving for everyone, and that we would want to encourage that in our students, to the new students that arrive with that language. There's such an important, as Giles says, there's such an important aspect of social and emotional learning, which actually sits alongside as a bed partner with English language learning.
I think that's so interesting, and I love what you were saying about the wider community as well, that actually it's not just the children, it is the parents, and giving them that understanding of what their children are going through. But I totally agree. I was fortunate enough to visit Russia before a while ago, and I felt really overwhelmed being in a country where I didn't speak the language, I couldn't make myself understood, and I couldn't read the signs, and it was the first time in my life I'd felt like that, and it gave me a real appreciation of how alienating it must feel to suddenly land in an environment where you don't communicate, which I think makes it all the more impressive that these children go on to graduate with top results, some of them in their second or third language. I think that is a real tribute to all that you do as a school, or as schools out here. So just sort of back to this sort of honouring the kind of language, how does that work at Southview? How do you kind of make sure, because there's a lot of research to say that when you switch into an English medium curriculum, you kind of arrest your reading and your spoken language, not your reading and your written language of your native language, the spoken kind of carries on. Does Southview have a sort of programme to support that too?
We very much celebrate our multicultural community. We pride ourselves on being an international school with a British curriculum, and adding to your point, that I think inclusion through representation as well. We have learning support assistants who are Russian speakers, Arabic speakers, who are able to identify on a real human, relatable level to our students as well, and who act as invaluable sources of not only academic tutors, shall we say, but also from that empathetic side of being able to be someone with whom they can confide in and, talk about their issues beyond the classroom as well. So we try and support them 360 and celebrate, as I said, their languages, their culture through representation. So we make sure our classrooms are dual language. We use dual language coding, lots of we're big fans of using the widget tool in the school so that there's lots of translation as well, so that the children feel represented, as you say, for those whose script is not English. It's nice to see their language represented around the school as well and celebrate it.
So I think what's so interesting for me is I think when we started this conversation, I was thinking it was going to be very much, EAL, this is how it's delivered, this is what you need to know. But actually it turns out to be so much of a much bigger piece, and the social and emotional development, the kind of parents, the community, and the whole school. It's a much wider topic than I think perhaps I had originally realised. So thank you all very much indeed for sharing that. I think just the last thing I would just ask you all is, what can parents do to support their children as they enter into this kind of new English language environment? Is there one tip, Neil, that you would share with parents as to how they can help their children?
Well, I think engage with the school. That's of utmost importance. We know that it's important for the child's sense of welfare not to lose their sense of home identity. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you've come from Japan, don't lose everything of Japan in your desperate bid to have your child be a fluent English language speaker, because that's an important part of a child being settled. But do make the most of what schools are offering. Schools are very keen, they're incentivized and motivated to make sure that the children acquire English quickly, and so they want to reach out and to help. They want to advise you about different things that you can do, and they want to offer programs and to do whatever can to make sure that your child is progressing at an optimum rate. Not overly quickly, not burning out, and not just chugging along slowly, so at an optimum rate. So I think the first thing to do is to have open conversations. Don't hide anything from the school. You can be fully frank and open with the school. They will be the same with you, and together in partnership, you will be able to work forward for that child to be able to make progress.
Okay, so open communication and treating this as a kind of collaborative partnership. Chelsea, what would you say if you were talking to a parent? What would be a sort of practical piece of advice you could give them?
I mean, I think, of course, I would parrot what was just said. I think maybe on a more specific level, I would just really emphasize to parents that reinforcing literacy in both the home language and the target language is really important. You know, we say this to all of our parents. It's good for everyone, but especially important, I think, for our English language learners, making sure that they're continuing to build literacy in their first language, and then also taking time to really spend time reading in the target language at whatever level is appropriate for them. But building those language skills through reading is really, really key.
Okay, and as you say, interesting, this in both the target and the home language. Gemma, what would be your kind of key piece of advice to a parent?
Again, just to reiterate your point that the home language is so important. They can make cognitive connections when they are fully proficient within their home language, and it's their identity. So each of us here have a strong sense of identity of where we're from, and that should be still encouraged within the children. With regards to the learning of English, of course, there are many things that we can suggest: watching, programs on TV, reading, making friends, and all of those things. But I think, again, it's key to maintain that first language, and the other language, English will come.
Will follow. That. And Giles, the final word to you in terms of kind of advising.
You gave me the graveyard question number 4 there. Said everything already. So one big one, I mean, there's plenty of research evidence out there for bilingual children about speed of growth if they're bilingual at home. So as part of that journey of collaboration with the school, particularly if parents are English language learners themselves and relatively low proficiency at that point in time, to actually engage with the school in supporting their own development and growth, because it will in turn accelerate their own children's adoption of that program. I think that's super important. There's also a word of caution here, because there's also literature that suggests that when you go beyond bilingualism to trilingualism and multilingualism, it actually starts to become cognitively challenging for the children of a particular age. So I've seen programs where 4 or 5 languages are encouraged to be spoken between the ages of 3 and 6. That is actually not very helpful and quite damaging. And particularly if your child is a language learner, they need to be able to work mostly on that bilingual front first of all, and then adapt the languages as they're capable to be able to do that. So I think also use the expertise. I mean, we do have in our schools, which is amazing, we have experts in the room who really do know the psychology of the development of the children related to language development, and they are the best people to advise families over how to improve that acquisition over time. So don't be a stranger. Don't sit at home hoping the school's going to do it all for you. Be engaged with part of that process. That's what I would say.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all so much. I think that's been really illuminating, and I think it's cast a light on lots of different aspects of the kind of language acquisition process as a non-native English speaker. So thank you very much indeed to Chelsea and to Giles and to Neil and to Gemma for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us too.
Pleasure. Well, we had the biggest audience. Good job. Good job. Very nice. Well done.
Thank you all very much.
Would you like my microphone back? Drop the mic.
got one more.